I call the honourable member Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, that was a very disappointing speech from a more reasonable member of the National Government, which really highlighted the deficiencies in this government's approach to dealing with child abuse and family violence. And I think it's pretty appalling to say that the reason domestic violence legislation hasn't been progressed is because Labor passed the Electoral Finance Act. Now, Mr Burrows didn't actually explain why it hasn't been progressed in his term of government. He gave a cursory mention of poverty and the connection between child abuse and poverty, and then moved on and ignored any discussion of that issue, which is actually at the core of this. And then we just got a rant against members on this side of the House, like my colleagues Carmel Sepuloni and Stuart Williams-Seot, who I would respectfully say knows his community in South Auckland a lot better, Mr Burrows, than you know his community, and my colleague Carmel Sepuloni, who knows her community in West Auckland very, very well as well. And I know from my colleague Stuart Williams-Seot in South Auckland that family violence, child abuse is a big problem and it needs to be addressed, and Labor is supporting this legislation, so I don't know why we had to be yelled at like that. We are supporting this legislation because we want as many tools as we can to deal with child abuse and family violence, but we are going to point out the double standard in a government that stands up in this House and gives these fine speeches about child abuse and family violence and what we need to do, and then with the other hand cuts funding to the very agencies that are working at the coalface to deal with child abuse and to deal with family violence. Because it's all very well to pass legislation dealing with the tragic death or injury of a child after the fact, after the crime has taken place. I mean, that's fine. People need to be held responsible for what they do, or in terms of letting it happen, what they don't do. But it doesn't change the fact that a child has still died, a child has still been abused, and unless we make that our focus, unless we say our focus has to be that we don't need laws like this anymore because we are dealing with the issue of child abuse so that children are not being put in that situation in the first place, then debates like this are pointless. We're going to go round and round in circles. It's ambulance at the bottom of the cliff stuff. And what we've been talking about in the Labor Party is putting children at the core of the policy work that we do. And I can tell you that if the government had done that, we wouldn't have seen the cuts in family violence spending that we saw this year. Right. It is unbelievable that Women's Refuge had their funding cut by more than $700,000 a year. Unbelievable. How can that be justified given the family violence problems that we have in this country, given that these are the people that take the women and the children out of those dangerous environments and give them a safe place to stay? And they had their funding cut. I want to talk about the Tairawhiti Abuse Intervention Network, or TAME. Now, this is an organisation of social service providers in Gisborne and the East Coast who've come together to deal with the horrible reality that we have an enormous problem with family violence and child abuse in Gisborne. We're one of the worst in the country. And they've been doing amazing work, and they've been working together very well. It involves a wide range of organisations, including government departments, including the police. And they're actually starting to get results. So imagine their surprise when earlier this year they were told that their funding was not secure, that they were going to have to apply to keep their child advocates who are doing amazing work around the country and are now gone, unless communities have been able to find the funding to keep them on themselves. And not only that, that when they finally did get the funding, well, they were told this at the beginning of June, they had to get their applications in. So from the 1st of July, they didn't even know if their funding was going to be able to continue, if they could continue to employ their staff. They were having to jump through ridiculous bureaucratic hoops to keep doing what they've always done very, very well, because this government decided that in a desperate attempt to pay for last year's unaffordable tax cuts, that, by the way, didn't go to the very families that we're talking about, that they decided they'd trim some money from family violence funding. Well, the TAME network were very disappointed. They didn't get all the money that they were hoping that they would get. And even worse, they're now on an annual funding regime where they don't know from year to year whether or not they're going to have any security of funding, whether or not they're going to get funding at all. Now, if you really want to do something about family violence, to do something about child abuse, why would you do that? That's why the words from the members opposite are so hollow. Because speeches in this House are not going to make a difference when you are chopping off at the knees the very organisations who are at the coalface every single day. Every single day. Because those are the people who are actually going to get some traction when we talk about family violence and when we talk about dealing with child abuse. And I want to talk about some of the changes that are happening in Housing New Zealand at the moment, because these are changes which are also going to make it even harder for us to get on top of this problem. Now, I've had people who have come to me, and I had one in my office a couple of weeks ago, a woman who had taken her 6-year-old daughter out of a gang house. Now, that woman deserves a medal as far as I'm concerned. She was born into a gang. Everyone she knows is in the gang. That's just the reality of her life. But she wanted better for her daughter than she had. So she moved to a Housing New Zealand house. Her daughter was doing well in school. Now, she had some issues with intimidation from the gang because they would come around and try and scare her because, you know, they don't like people who walk out and try and leave that situation. And this created a situation with her neighbours who were understandably concerned at this activity. And they complained to Housing New Zealand and she was evicted. She was evicted. Now, tell me on what planet it's good for that 6-year-old child whose mother took her out of a gang house to send her back to a gang house because of petty politics from this national government and their approach to Housing New Zealand. And I am sick and tired of seeing the people coming through my office, and I know my colleagues feel the same way, who are victims of the stupid policy that Housing New Zealand has of a one-size-fits-all, we're going to get the bad buggers out, all that kind of rhetoric, without looking at the individual circumstances of each situation and saying, what does it mean for the child in that situation? What is in the best interest of that child? Is it letting them stay in the Housing New Zealand house, away from a gang environment, or is it being able to stand up in Parliament and say, we're getting tough on really bad tenants and sending that 6-year-old back to a gang house? How is that in the best interest of children and in the best interest of keeping children free of abuse in this country? It's not. It's not at all. And then we have the changes that are happening with the current restructuring of Housing New Zealand, where apparently our social housing provider no longer has any social role at all, where Housing New Zealand staff, tenancy managers who have traditionally done a fantastic job working with tenants, developing relationships, connecting them up to other social service providers, other government departments where appropriate, keeping them housed, making sure they can sustain their tenancies, which for some tenants is not easy for a range of reasons. The reality is we have a number of people in Housing New Zealand properties that have high and complex needs and who are always going to require some level of pastoral care and support in order to be able to sustain their tenancies. Now, I know the government doesn't like that reality. I know they'd like to get all these people out of Housing New Zealand, but that's the reality. That's why we have social housing, to protect these people, to look after them, and to make sure that every child in New Zealand is able to grow up in appropriate, affordable, safe housing. But now this government says, actually no, Housing New Zealand has no social role whatsoever. Well, do you know what? Tenancy managers are often that fresh pair of eyes that walks into a house and sees that something is wrong, that walks into a house and sees that there is a need that has to be addressed. And this government has said now they should just ignore that. They should just ignore that because, oh no, that's Child, Youth and Families' problem. Oh no, that's MSD's problem. One of the biggest problems we have in our public sector is the siloing, is everyone pushing these people from one government department to another and no one taking responsibility. Why are we not saying to every government department that comes into contact with a vulnerable family or a family where there might be some need that there is no wrong door, that where there is a problem we fix it, that where a tenancy manager sees a need they deal with it. They don't just say it's no longer our problem. They don't just say, oh, that's MSD's, so I don't have to worry about the things that I've seen. The changes to Housing New Zealand are going to see our vulnerable children in an even more perilous situation, And none of the fine words that we've heard from government members tonight will do anything to improve their position.
Call Jamie Lee Ross.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to